Your podcast is a powerful tool that serves your audience and your business. But how do you manage it all, bring in new listeners, and convert those listeners into customers? That's what this show is all about. Welcome to Podcasting for Educators. I'm Sarah Whitaker, classroom teacher turned podcast manager, and I'm here to help you get the most out of your show, all while making an impact on other educators. Hello, and welcome back to Podcasting for Educators. If this is your first time tuning in, thank you so much for being here. And if you have been a listener for a while now, of course, I'm always grateful for you to be here as well. I always forget to do this, but I wanted to start out this episode reading a recent review that someone left on Apple Podcasts. This is from Michelle_87, and she says, Sarah is amazing and is a wealth of knowledge. Her podcast, courses, and Facebook group has helped me to finally create my very own podcast. She gives so much information on each episode, and I learn something new every time. I'm so thankful for Sarah. I highly recommend anyone that has the desire to start a podcast to listen to Podcasting for Educators. Thank you so much for your review. I am a words of affirmation kind of girl. So if you find this podcast to be helpful, one of the best ways and easiest ways that you can thank me is by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or just sending me a message on Instagram to let me know that you're listening and that it's helpful for you. And in her review, Michelle mentioned that my Facebook group has been helpful for her. And that group that she's referring to is the private Facebook group that comes with my online course, Podcasting for Educators Prep School. And it's just a nice community where you can connect with other podcasters and come with any kinds of questions that you have along the way. And this month, we're also starting our first live monthly trainings and Q&A sessions in there, which I am super excited about. So even if you've already started your podcast and you don't necessarily need help with getting started, but you are looking for a community of other podcasters and somewhere you can go to get your questions answered and to share your wins and to kind of troubleshoot anything, then we would love to have you over in the prep school. You can learn more about that at podcastingforeducators.com/prep school. Okay, today we are talking about where to find great guests for your podcast. The whole process of finding and booking guests for your podcast is one of the top things that a lot of podcasters tell me is a really big challenge for them. And I've done a few episodes on advice on bringing guests onto your show. A couple of those to check out would be episodes 18 and 19. And those are all about booking the right guests and tips for guest interviews. But it's really interesting because finding guests is actually one of my favorite things to do for my own show. And the whole process from finding people to booking them to recording and following up after recording, it feels very easy for me and fun for me. And I mean, I think that part of that is because I have systems set up in place to make it as streamlined as possible. And it's kind of just always in the back of my mind. I have a big running list of people that I would love to have on this show as a guest, even if I haven't even reached out to them yet. And recently, when I asked specifically about like what part of guests is challenging for you, I asked that on my Instagram stories. And a lot of you said that it's the process of actually finding the right guests for your show. Like, where do I look? Where do I find these guests? So that's what we're going to specifically talk about today. I want to be able to give you several different ideas of places where you can easily find guests without spending a ton of time doing it. And before we get into that, I just want to give you a little, I don't know if disclaimer is the right word, but it's the only word that I can think of right now. And that is, don't be afraid to ask anybody to be a guest on your show. I don't care who it is. It could be Oprah. It could be Britney Spears. It could be Justin Timberlake. If you have somebody that you really would love to have on your show and that you feel would be a good fit for your audience and would help your audience in some way, just go for it. Because the worst, like the absolute worst thing that's going to happen is they'll say no, or you'll just never get a response from them, even after following up 50 times. There are people that you might just never hear back from, or you might just get a no. And that's it. And you're no worse off than where you are right now. But I say try and don't be afraid to ask, because I can tell you from my experience that I have had clients get people on their show that they never would have thought would say yes. People really do surprise you. They might not, but they might. And that's reason enough to try and to go for it. So when you're thinking of guests that you want to have on your show, if there's anybody who just kind of feels out of reach, I would encourage you to just go for it and give it a try. Okay, in just a second, I'm going to give you 7 specific places to go to look for guests. But I want to tell you first that my approach, and something that might be helpful for you to think about, is to first have topics in mind that I really want to cover on the show, and then work backwards from there. So think about what you feel like your audience really needs, and then think about, okay, I know I want to cover this. Who can be that person to cover this specific topic? An example of this is that I wanted an email marketing expert to come on to this podcast, because that's a question that's been coming up a lot with my audience is, how do I best promote my podcast episodes in my weekly email? And that's a great question. And I've never had an email marketing person on before. So I just booked a really awesome email marketing expert who you are going to love. We have our interview next month in September. And so that should be airing in September or October. But that's what I'm talking about, is think about your topic and then work backwards. So let's talk about where you can actually go to find guests. And as I'm listing these places off, I want you to just connect with one of these ideas. Do not feel like you need to go and look in all of these places. Pick one, maybe 2 that sound like they would align with you and your show and the types of people that you're looking for. Number 1, the first place you could go to find great guests would be inside of Facebook groups. Again, think about the topics that you want to cover and look for groups that would have those kinds of people in them. So back to my example of finding an email marketing expert. I wouldn't be looking in podcast groups for that. I wouldn't be looking in teacher groups for that. I would be going out and looking for groups that are solely based around email marketing or entrepreneurship type of groups. And if you have your own Facebook group, definitely leverage that to find guests for your show. Invite on members of your community. This is a really great way to give people in your community a voice on your platform. And it can also be a great way to share a testimonial type of episode where somebody from your community is sharing how maybe one of your resources or how your monthly membership has helped them accomplish something, so that your other listeners can get that firsthand story. And those types of episodes can often be the deciding factor for somebody to go ahead and make a purchase on whatever that guest is speaking on. Number 2 would be Instagram. Now, when I'm on Instagram and I'm kind of just like scrolling and I'm looking at people's stories, I am always paying attention to like when people share other people's posts or people are talking about things on their own Instagram stories. I'm always kind of looking at it from the perspective of how could that they're talking about apply to my audience? Like if it's something that really catches my attention. And if I see somebody share an Instagram profile of someone who does kind of catch my eye and looks interesting to me, what they're speaking on sounds really interesting, and it kind of stops my scroll, I will go over to their page, I'll go over to their Instagram, I'll go over to their website, and I'll just kind of check them out. If they have a blog or they have a podcast, I'll kind of scan through and see if there are any topics that would be something that would be a good fit for this show. I mean, truly, if I come up with podcast ideas from like one Instagram post. Like I have reached out to people because I saw one Instagram post that was very like thought-provoking or very helpful for me. And I will message them and say, hey, I love like this a very specific thing that you're talking about. Let's turn it into a podcast episode. And then of course you can also, search through hashtags. So if you have a topic in mind, come up with some keywords that you could search through on Instagram. You can also look at the profiles, the pages of other people in your same similar space who have a similar audience as you. And you can kind of look at the people that they are engaging with and communicating with and see if anybody pops out to you there. The third place where you can go to find great guests for your podcast, and this is probably my favorite thing to do, is through other podcasts. So check out other podcasts. This could be like your direct competitors' podcasts to see what guests they've had on. That's definitely one route to go. That's one place that you can go for some ideas. But I want you to be really careful with that because especially if you're in like a really small niche, you don't want to have on the exact same guests that all of your direct competitors have had on. Because if there's only 5 popular podcasts in your niche and they all have on the same guests, well, they probably have a lot of overlap with their listeners. And so you want to be bringing some new, fresh perspectives on. So you can absolutely look there as a starting point and you can probably find some great people, but don't just rely on that. More so, I recommend that you're looking for kind of parallel shows. Think outside the box here. For me, I like to check out other online business and marketing podcasts because that's where I'm going to be able to find people that fill the gaps for me. I'm not going to like other podcasts about podcasts to look for guests. And this is really kind of a big message that I want to drive home in this episode is do not be afraid to get outside of your circle, your comfort zone here. Because if you're in the TPT space, it is very, very possible that there's a lot of the same well-known faces in your niche. Think about how you can get outside of that TPT network to bring guests in. And I'm going to give you a very specific example here to help with your brainstorming here. A great example of this is one of my clients. She's in the TPT space. She supports upper elementary teachers with literacy strategies. She had on this past year, she had on a guest who was very different from her usual guests because she does have a lot of her guests have been other people in the TPT space, which is great. And you should have some of that. But I also want you to think about getting outside of that too. So anyway, this guest, first of all, he was a male. I think that this was definitely the first. I think that this is the only male that she's had on her show. So that alone was different. And he is a financial expert. And he did an episode on investing and saving for retirement as a teacher. So again, he's not someone who only works with teachers, but she found a way to use his expertise and turn it into an episode that would be specific to her audience. And we were really curious to see how this episode would do. And it is still one of her most downloaded, most popular episodes. Hopefully that example can kind of start some wheels turning for you about types of guests that you could have on your show that might be outside of the box of what you usually have on, but still be a very helpful episode for your listeners. Okay, the fourth place that you can go to find guests for your show is virtual summits and other kinds of collaborations that you see happening online. Now, virtual summits are very, very popular right now. And I think for the most part, most virtual summits that I see have at least some version of a free ticket. And the free ticket is usually, the caveat is usually that you have limited access to the sessions, and then you can upgrade your ticket to get, bonus resources and lifetime or longer access to the sessions. But if you were to approach virtual summits as a way to find possible podcast guests, you could just get a free ticket, or to be honest, even just looking at the virtual summit sales page, landing page, and looking at the lineup of speakers, that's a great place to find new faces. There's usually a picture of the person, a bio, and then typically you can just click on the person and it will link you to their website or their social media where you can learn more about them. But the great thing about looking in a place like a virtual summit is that these are usually going to be people who are comfortable speaking and people who are already looking for visibility opportunities. And you know that there's usually some sort of authority figure in their space to be a speaker at one of these summits. And if you're getting a ticket to this summit, you can then check out their session and see if you like how they're delivering the information. So I think that's kind of a unique place to go that you maybe haven't thought of before. And I'm just going to pause here because some of you might be, and this kind of goes back to what I said at the beginning of the episode about not being afraid to reach out to people. But if you've never done like a cold reach out to somebody to ask to be on your podcast, I encourage you to try it because most people are going to be thrilled to be asked to be a guest on your podcast. And even if you've never said a word to them in your life, just go for it and just talk to them. And it might spark a great relationship with somebody new. And it might end up being one of your most downloaded episodes. So if you are seeing people online who you think would be great guests and who seem really interesting and who have a lot of information to offer, just go for it. Just ask them, even if it's a total cold reach out. Okay, these next two ideas are ways that you can get a little bit of help when it comes to finding guests. So the fifth place you can go is to ask your audience what they want to hear. So you can put out just a quick poll on your social media or through email or both. You could do this like consistently, like once a month or once every couple months. And you could just ask them, hey, who would you like to hear on the show? So if it's in your Instagram stories, you can just put the question box, who would you like to hear on the podcast? And if you're not getting a lot of responses that way, you could simplify it a little bit. Instead of asking for specific names, you could say, what topics would you like to hear covered on the show? And that goes back to my point before of nailing down the topic that you want to cover and then working backwards and finding the right person to speak on that topic. So experiment, try it out with your audience, see what works best. But you might find that having them recommend topics for specific people might give you better results, or it might not. It just kind of depends on your audience. The sixth idea is to put the opportunity of guesting out there and let the guests come to you. So this takes a little bit of the work out for you. So what this would look like, or how I recommend that you would do this, would be to make an announcement that you are accepting guests for your podcast. You can do this on your social media, on your Instagram, on your Facebook, wherever. You can put an email out. You could also, some podcasters will actually have this on their website, on their podcast page, it's usually at the bottom of their podcast page. They'll have a little form that people could fill out if they want to be a guest or if they want to recommend somebody as a guest. Now, if you do something like this, whether it's on your website or it's through email or it's on social media, do not just share your booking link for guest interviews and say, here's my link. If you want to be a guest, sign up for a time, because that will definitely backfire very quickly. You will very likely get people that are not a good fit for your show, and you don't want that. So like for me, my booking link for my podcast interviews is set to private, meaning that like it can't be found through search online or anything like that. So my suggestion would be, when you make this announcement, you can share an interest form for people to fill out. So you could share a link to, for me, I use ClickUp, so it would be a ClickUp form. Maybe for you, it is a Google form, a type form, whatever it is. So you would say, I'm accepting new guests for my podcast this quarter. If you're interested in being a guest, please fill out this form. And if I would like to move forward with scheduling, I will reach out to you if it's a good fit or something along those lines. And on that interest form, you can have them answer questions like, tell me about yourself and your business. Who do you help? Why do you feel like you would be a good guest on my podcast? What would you like to focus on in the interview? Or what do you think would be a good topic for us to talk about? So you're really kind of putting the work on them to show you why they're a good fit for your show. And that way you can then look over these forms. You can screen the person before you reach out to them with a link to book an interview. And kind of along these same lines, people might pitch you So you might get emails if this hasn't happened to you yet. It very well might in the future, but people might email you pitching themselves or pitching their clients, asking if they can be a guest on your show. It will likely happen at some point if it hasn't already. If this happens for you, you need to vet this person before accepting or before sending them any kind of booking link. So if you get a pitch, you need to go and check that person out, check their website, check their socials, make sure that what you're going to talk about is very clear and that they would be a good fit for your podcast. And then my 7th suggestion of where you can go to find great guests for your show would be guest directories. So there are actual formal podcast directories out there. Most of them have some sort of fee, like monthly fee attached to them. Some might even have just an annual fee that you pay. You could always, if it's a monthly fee, you could always try it out for a month, see if you like it. But if you just head to Google and type in podcast guest services or podcast guest matching or something along those lines, you'll see a bunch pop up. But matchmaker.fm is one that comes to mind. Podcast Collaborative is one. I've been a member of theirs before and they're great. But those are places that you can go. And if you are in the education space, because podcasting in this space, specifically for educators, is still in the early stages, these formal types of directories, you're probably going to find a lot of people who are outside of this education space. Again, that doesn't mean that you should avoid it. You very well might be able to find some really great guests that way, but you're probably at this point in time not going to find a lot of educator type of guests. Okay. Quick recap. The 7 places that I just mentioned where you can find guests would be number 1, Facebook groups. Number 2, Instagram. Number 3, other podcasts. And remember, not necessarily in the same niche as yours. Number 4, virtual summits. Number 5, your audience. Number 6, putting the opportunity of guesting out to your audience and letting guests come to you. And number 7, formal guest directories. Now, very quickly, if you are in the Podcasting for Educators Prep School, there are a few different lessons in the course on guests that talk about the type of guest interviews that you can do, how to set up a guest booking system, email swipe copy that you can use for reaching out to guests, following up, thanking them. All of that is in there for you. So if you haven't checked that out, I just want you to know that that resource is in there. All right. I think that is enough for today. I will be back next week with a guest episode. I'll see you then. Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. To keep this conversation going, connect with me on Instagram at Podcasting for Educators. I'm always looking for an excuse to talk about podcasting. If you're looking for support in launching, managing, or growing your podcast, check out my online course, the Podcasting for Educators Prep School, at podcastingforeducators.com/prep school. I'll see you here next time.